Hi, this is Beck from the Twisting Twine and welcome to this tutorial on how to crochet a triangle using the mesh stitch. So question, can you make a triangle out of a mesh stitch pattern? I was asked this question recently and I didn't know the answer. I'd never thought of it before. I've never tried making one myself, so thought I would have a fiddle around and see what I could come up with. So this video is what I've come up with. We're going to start off with approximately 30 stitches as a base anchor foundation row, and we're going to build our mesh stitch off of that. So for this experiment, we're going to be using a 3-chain mesh stitch pattern. So as you can see, I'm chaining 3, I skip a stitch, and then I do a slip stitch into that stitch next to the one that I've skipped. So I'm going to continue with this pattern of chaining 3, skipping a stitch, slip stitch, chaining 3, etc. until I get to the end of this row. In this first row, I'm not doing anything to shape the triangle. It's just that foundation first row of mesh stitch. So continue until you get to the end of this row, and then we'll start working on the next one. So this is what your mesh stitch should look like. You've got little half loops or arches. Our last slip stitch for this row is going into the top chains from the previous row, and it doesn't want to go in. It probably is being a bit tricky. There we go. And that completes the first row of mesh stitch. So this is what the first row of your mesh stitch will look like, built on top of that single crochet row that I did at the beginning. You can see your little half loops or your little arches, and these will become stretched out as we do more and more rows. So to start with, in getting our triangle shape, we're going to begin the next row, so chaining 3, and then you're going to just put that slip stitch into that first loop, that first little archway that we've done from our previous row, and then you're chaining another 3, and then into the second loop, and you just continue with this for our second row of chaining 3, slip stitch into the loop from the previous row. So the last slip stitch goes into the very last loop of the row, and that completes our second row. Starting the third row, you just chain 3 again, and then you do your first slip stitch into the first loop and continue in exactly the same fashion for the rest of the row. Okay, so as we approach the end of our third row, you've got your last little loop here. We're going to slip stitch into this bigger loop next to it, slip stitch, and then we chain 3, and then we're not doing anything with that little loop. We turn our work and we're going to do slip stitch into that very first loop, which our chains are hanging off of. So it creates this sort of angle as we start to move in. This is kind of like our decreasing stitch mode now. So then the rest of the row is continued as you have been with that chain 3, slip stitch into the next loop, chain 3, slip stitch, etc. until you get to the other end of this row. So as we come to the end of this row, we've got that little loop on the end. We're going to do our slip stitch into the last big loop, and then we're going to chain 3, and we're going to ignore that little loop again like we did at the beginning of this row, and we're going to do our slip stitch into the first loop, and that creates another of those small loops. And again, we're making this slow moving in, slow decreasing stitch mode, and we're going to come in incrementally each row at the end and beginning of each row. So now we just continue with our mesh stitch pattern until we get to the end of the row, and then it's rinse and repeat. So at the beginning of this next row, we're just doing what we have been doing, creating that small loop, which gives us that step in for the beginning and end of each of our rows. So as we get to the top of our triangle, you find that you have less mesh stitches in each row. So in this one, we have come to our final 2. So now we're moving into our last stitch. So do the chain 3, and you just slip stitch into that very last available loop, and that creates the top of our triangle. So it worked. I'm pretty excited. It looks like a triangle. We've got our single crochet base there, and I'm just really happy that it wasn't too difficult to actually make. It's still nice and stretchy, which is what we want, and I'm thinking that we'll match that bottom single crochet base with the sides as well. So we might have a go at that. So we're just going to chain 2, and then we're going to single crochet into our spaces. So single crochet into that first space, then it's single crochet into those mini loops that we've got hanging out on the sides there. So single crochet into the chain space, like that, and then the next single crochet into that little mini loop, and we continue until we get to that single crochet base row that we have at the bottom of our triangle. Oops. So continuing single crochet until we get to the bottom. So finishing up, just evenly spacing these single crochets, I'm just shoving the very last one somewhere into that single crochet base row that we had, so it sort of looks a bit even. So you can see how it looks a bit more finished instead of that bumpier side, but you could make it look however you liked. And it still has maintained its stretch, which I'm also pretty happy with, because that's generally what we use the mesh stitch for, is for something that requires a little bit of stretch. So thank you for joining me in discovering if we can make a triangle with the mesh stitch. I'm pretty happy with the end result, and I hope that you found this helpful. Please check out some crochet patterns and other stitch tutorials on this channel. And for free crochet patterns and tutorials, head over to the Twisting Twine blog. As always, happy crocheting.